Right, well, it is 1 o'clock. So welcome everyone to the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Carbon Markets and Credits webinar. My name is Jamie Benning and I'm the Assistant Director for Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension, and I'll be your moderator today. Carbon markets are a hot topic right now. See them a lot in the news and discussed among agricultural circles and beyond. And our field and campus specialists have also been receiving a lot of questions about carbon market opportunities. And we wanted to take this time today in this webinar format to provide a platform for discussing the state of carbon markets today, the science of carbon sequestration, considerations for those that may be thinking about entering into carbon market opportunities. So our format today will be 20-minute presentations by our panelists here. And then we'll follow that with about 10 minutes of questions and discussion for each speaker. And then any remaining questions remaining time that we have at the end, we'll open it up to all 3 of our speakers to have some dialogue around those questions. I encourage all of you to enter your questions either into the chat or the Q&A box as you have them during the presentations. And we'll work behind the scenes to get those to the speakers so that they can answer those during their 10-minute Q&A time or at the end of the webinar. We will be recording this webinar and putting that on a website for you to review later or to pass on to colleagues. I'll add that link in the chat right here. So that's where we will post this recording along with the resources that the speakers referenced during their discussions today. So I will now pass it over to our first speaker. Chad Hart, professor and extension economist, will be sharing with us an introduction to carbon markets and carbon credits, going to set the stage for what we're discussing and to get us started. So I will turn it over to Chad. Welcome, Chad, and thanks for being here with us.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you all very much for attending today. I look at myself as I'm sort of the setup guy and then help wrap up a little bit. I'll help set up as we get into the discussion about carbon. Marshall will talk more about the science behind it. Christine will talk about the legal aspects of it. But when we're thinking about this, the carbon markets, I'm going to take us back to the carbon cycle. And so when you think about it, what we're trying to do is we're trying to set up a marketplace where we can trade the ability to emit carbon. And in this case, this is a graphic that Noah put together of the carbon cycle. And the way I'll describe it is this: what we're trying to do is reduce the size of the arrows that are pointing up in this graphic or increase the size of the arrows pointing down. The concern here is that as we build up more and more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that we are warming the planet and creating some more extreme weather conditions as we look out there. So the idea of a carbon market is to create an economic opportunity for individuals, businesses, companies to trade the ability to emit carbon so that we find the most efficient use of carbon, if you will, and be able to reduce those environmental impacts as we're looking out there. And agriculture is part of this mix. If you look at the far left-hand side of the graphic, the idea is ag is part of the carbon cycle, not only sequestering carbon in the soils, but also we release some carbon as well. But the idea is what this shows is carbon is constantly moving throughout our global system here through both biological and man-made processes. And it's that idea of utilizing our man-made processes here to help address some of the issues that we're worried about. Now, when it comes to what do you actually trade in the carbon market, that's where we have to talk about creating a carbon credit, or what you can think of it as it's a tradable asset, like a certificate or a permit. And we've seen a lot of discussion about these, especially here recently as we develop digital things that we're trading, such as the NFT craze that that has been talked about in the news, where you're trading something that has like a digital picture or a file. In this case, what you're trading is this asset that is a permit that sort of represents the right to release or emit carbon into the atmosphere. And the idea is that this credit can be created in a bunch of different ways. But what we first got to agree on as we're trying to set up a market is, okay, what is it this credit going to represent? And what the markets have coalesced around is the idea that carbon credit represents 1 metric ton. That's basically 2,200 pounds worth of carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere, or an equivalent amount of another greenhouse gas. So it's not just carbon necessarily that you might be trading within a carbon credit. It can cover other greenhouse gases. Now, credits are created when people or businesses reduce their carbon emissions, or on the other hand, sequester carbon. But in order to measure that, you have to set it up against some sort of baseline so that we can determine when the carbon is being captured or stored. And that's one of the major challenges here, because we're trading something, again, that we really cannot see directly. So we have to create other measures of how we're going to verify these carbon credits as we move forward. And so when you're thinking about these things, first thing I want to point out, and let me go back here to the carbon cycle, is as you're looking at this, there are all sorts of different pieces. Like I say, looking at the physical, the agronomic side of this, the legal side, the economic side. One of the key resources I'd point you to is the College of Ag and the Bioeconomy Institute has put together a series they called Conversations About Carbon, to help walk through some of the basic issues around the carbon cycle and this formation of carbon markets. And when you're thinking about the carbon credits themselves, like I say, they can be created in a variety of ways. You can think in some cases of reducing the amount of carbon being emitted. For example, myself as an extension professional who drives around the state of Iowa an awful lot in my normal job, one of the potential ways for me to create a carbon credit myself is to basically create the baseline of, okay, here's what I drove in 2019. And then if I drive less in succeeding years, it's possible for me to document that. And that has the potential to be considered for a carbon credit. You could also look at folks switching to cleaner fuel sources in order to continue to run their businesses, but find ways to reduce the amount of carbon that they're emitting. Other cases, we'd be talking about trying to capture carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it back into the soils or in the oceans. And so you'll see a lot of discussion about planting trees, restoring wetlands. What this points to is there's not just one way to create a carbon credit. There are a variety of ways in which it can be done, and it can be done both within agriculture and outside of agriculture. But one of the key features to a carbon credit is the ability to verify that carbon is being either sequestered or the release is being reduced. And so that's one of the challenges that the carbon market faces, is setting up that verification strategy as we look out there. Now, as far as how agriculture can participate, like I say, again, a variety of ways. Crop and livestock producers can participate in creating carbon credits. We can think about it from the crop side of moving from conventional tillage to reduced or no-till. A livestock, reducing the stocking rates on our pastures, planting cover crops, planting trees, reducing fertilizer rates. The idea is, again, we can participate both in sequestering the carbon or reducing the amount of carbon that we're releasing here. So there are many actions that can impact a farm's carbon footprint and can be utilized for farmers to create that carbon credit. But in this case, also timing matters as to when you do that practice or when you change things to reduce your carbon footprint. As I mentioned, with a carbon credit, you need a baseline. What are you measuring against when we're talking about the measurement of carbon here? And for most cases, the baseline is sort of, what are you currently doing? In fact, as we look at a lot of the proposed carbon market exchanges that we're seeing out there right now, a lot of them are focusing on the baseline is today, right now. And so looking at reducing your carbon footprint as we move forward over time. When we set it up that way, what the key word that's thrown around in the literature is called additionality. Basically looking at additional carbon savings that can be created in the future. and not necessarily looking at carbon savings that have occurred in the past, because those that have occurred in the past are sort of baked into the baseline. So like I say, most opportunities have the current farm practice as the baseline. However, there are some companies that do recognize that movements in the past do save some carbon. And so there's an opportunity out there for folks to do their homework and find the companies that do offer those potential. So if you've moved to no-till several years ago, you may not qualify for carbon credits with some companies, but you may end up qualifying for others depending upon how they look at this issue of additionality. Now, there are lots of questions that go around in terms of what's in a carbon contract. When you agree to create these carbon credits and sell them, what have you agreed to? And this would be a lot of probably the discussion that Christine will have with us here. But I want you to think about there's a variety of issues we're trying to address in this contract that are sort of taken care of for the most part when we think about traditional established markets. What you're trading, in this case, like I say, a carbon credit, we're still trying to figure out what all counts for that. So what practice changes are covered? Oftentimes the carbon contract will be very specific in that. How's the carbon measured? How are the payments and costs shared? There are a variety of issues that go in here. And so not only is, Iowa State researchers have been digging into these issues, but I'll recommend a couple of articles that I've seen from brethren in other states. In fact, one of them is the source here, University of Minnesota. But also I know Illinois, Purdue, various universities have put together lists of questions that farmers should ask not only themselves, but the companies they may be signing up with as they look at carbon opportunities here, so that you understand fully what is it you're agreeing to when you try to create these carbon credits and sell them on the open marketplace. Now, there are a lot of different ways to measure carbon as we're looking forward here as well. And I know that's part of the issue Marshall will get into later with us as far as things we know and don't know about the carbon cycle. Given that uncertainty that we've got out there, what we have seen companies do is they've set up sort of two different, if you will, approaches to how we're going to measure the carbon. The first one, and probably the most popular one we're seeing right now, is what I'll call a practice-based approach, where instead of trying to directly measure carbon in some way, shape, or form, what we're going to do is we're going to look at, we know that these practices that you can make changes with on your farm save some carbon. There may be some questions about how much, but we know that they at least hopefully save some. So instead of trying to measure that carbon directly, what we'll do is we'll pay you based upon making those changes in practice on the farm. So again, that move from conventional till to no-till, for example. And so they'll make that payment based upon the practice itself, relying upon the relationship between the practice and carbon savings in the future. And a lot, like I say, a lot of the companies that are out there right now working on carbon markets and carbon contracts follow that practice-based approach. But you also do see companies that are interested in moving to what I'll call an outcome-based approach, where we are actively trying to directly measure the carbon that is being saved or sequestered through these practices. And so oftentimes those companies will have that language directly into the contract saying how they will measure the carbon, how often they will measure the carbon. So again, it's very important as a producer looking at these opportunities to do a little homework here and research which of these approaches is the company that I'm working with here in carbon taking as we look forward. Now, not only do you have to wonder how we're going to measure the carbon, but then the next question becomes, how do you set that price? And so here we're arguably in the sort of early stages of trying to set up a national or global market for carbon, but we have seen some smaller regional efforts take hold over the past decade or so. The graphics I have on the screen right now highlight two of those efforts that are ongoing right now. The top graphic where it says ICE carbon up there talks about the Intercontinental Exchange. And we have seen two active futures markets for carbon develop over the past decade. One is centered on the European Union and looking at their carbon reduction strategies and footprint there. The other is based upon the California cap and trade market that they've set up for carbon. And so those have been around for a few years, and they have sort of set up an initial platform that we may see more fully developed as we look to advance these carbon opportunities into the future. In fact, that's what I would argue the bottom graphic on this chart is talking about. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is the futures market that we're used to looking at for agricultural commodities such as corn and cattle and hogs and soybeans, has been setting up what they're calling global emissions offset futures. Think of these as building that market towards active trading of carbon on platforms that we're used to working with within agriculture. So we are seeing those mechanisms building up over time. And finally, I'd argue the last sort of piece here that's starting to help build the mechanisms to create what I'll call a fully fledged carbon market is movement within the government itself to help set some of the regulations and boundaries around the market. Now, there's a lot of text on this graphic. I don't expect you to read most of it. I just want to point out that Congress is right now working on what's called the Growing Climate Solutions Act of 2021. This is an act that's passed the Senate. It's awaiting action in the House. But what it basically does is it says how the government's going to set up guidelines to help not only agricultural producers participate in any carbon markets that develop over time, but it's also going to provide technical assistance to help producers figure out how to make those practice changes that would fit within a carbon market. It's going to set up a list of protocols that companies that want to trade in these carbon markets that they must abide by. What are the information that they must self-certify under the program? And how will we provide that verification that I talked about when we're looking at these carbon credits, and how the government may step in to help evolve that? Like I say, this has passed the Senate, is awaiting action in the House, and it represents to me the third leg that's needed for these markets to truly take hold as we're looking forward out there. Because right now we're just in the beginning stages, I would argue, of creating these markets. What we have are many different companies that are creating sort of opportunities and negotiating their own space within the carbon market, but we haven't coalesced around a standardized market structure yet, but it's quite likely we will. There are several scientific, economic, legal, and social challenges to be addressed as we build that market out there. But what we're seeing now, the actions that we're seeing in Congress as far as the Growing Climate Solutions Act, what we're seeing with companies such as Bayer and Nori and Indigo Ag out there, they're outlining a framework for these markets and how they will perform over time. And we're also seeing interest from companies and people that want to purchase those credits, that are looking to be actively involved on the buying side of these markets. So we have all the ingredients to create a fully functional market, but we're still working our way there as we go forward. And so I put this quote at the bottom just to remind ourselves what we are at right now is we're in a process of creating a market, and that's a long journey. And every long journey begins with that single step. And so that's where we're at right now. We're building these single steps together to create a market that can move forward over time. And especially within agriculture, we've always been looking for those potential secondary markets that we can participate in, along with our primary markets, growing the crops and growing the livestock. Carbon represents probably the strongest potential secondary market we've seen in quite some time. With that, in order to keep us on time, I'm going to stop, see what questions we might have, and go from there. So Jamie, anybody pop in with something while I was chattering away there?
Yes, we had one. So it was, how can we set up a price point for carbon? Or, what could go into setting that offset or credit price?
Okay, so this is where I'm going to highly recommend one of the links that was popped up there from the University of Illinois, because I think when you're looking here, there's two pieces to that price component that each farmer should look at. One would be, let's call it the physical real cost of that change in practice you might be willing to take there. And so if you were moving from conventional till to no-till, I think it's up to the farmer to determine, okay, what is the cost of doing that to my farm? That should be one piece of the price you'd be willing to accept to make that move. I'd say the other one would be sort of your own, let's call it preferential idea about that movement. A lot of the folks that have made these moves into carbon markets have been individuals, I would say, that were thinking about making those changes in practice before the carbon market or this carbon opportunity existed. And so they were willing to, if you will, take on some of the costs themselves to feel that they were bettering their soils and their farms moving forward. And so, if you will, you can think of it as that was reducing the cost to them to need to recover from any sort of market. Other folks, if you're looking at something and you're really hesitant about it, you would be adding costs to here. So I think that's the major key here, is figuring out what is, one, the economic ramifications to your farm in making changes to participate in a carbon market. And the other is sort of the, for lack of a better term, I'll call it the psychological impact for you that you need to factor in there as well. But I can't give you one number. It's individual by farmer and by farm, I would argue.
So how about carbon emission reduction by kind of the greater industry, agribusinesses reducing hauling, how is that included, or is it included in some of this legislation, or is there more opportunity there?
Yep, there's definitely opportunities there. And in fact, when I come back on later on in this, a few of the packages that I'll be talking about they're not called carbon offset markets, but they're called inset markets. It's this idea that you may be trading with the company you're working with, and that you're creating a carbon savings that the company upstream or downstream can use to offset some of their emissions. And we do see a lot of efforts that way. You also, a lot of the, if you will, the customers that would be buying these carbon credits are looking to do the same thing. Probably the most famous one I can point to is one you probably see every day. Every day you probably go out to Google and do some search on that. If you look at the bottom of the Google page, you notice they have a little note down at the bottom that says carbon neutral since 2007. What Google is claiming there, and what they've done, is they say, okay, we know that our computing power and search engines emits carbon because we're utilizing a lot of power. So they went out and purchased carbon credits to offset those carbon emissions. So you do see, though, like I say, other industries buying into these credits to help offset their own emissions.
So another one, what are your thoughts about a policy setting the price on carbon, and any discussions in that area?
At least at this point, from the US perspective, there hasn't been talk about setting a price necessarily. That said, though, I think it really depends upon how these markets truly develop and how they're sort of imposed. There's talk about, when you look, for example, at the California cap and trade marketplace, there's a case where if you will, the government, the state government, has set up this regulation, and they've also tried to establish some minimum prices there, not necessarily setting the price, but at least setting a lower bound on the range of prices there. And I think we could see something like that develop here nationwide as we're looking forward. But at least right now, and like to say, the legislation we see currently being proposed in Congress, there's no discussion about price setting from a government perspective here. We'll sort of try to let the marketplace find the optimal price to create these changes out there.
Is Iowa State University following the Rural Investment to Protect Our Environment, or RIPE? I'm not familiar with this.
And I can't say as I am as either, so that's something we'll probably have to come back and address later.
We'll follow up on that and get back to you. All right, any other questions? And if not, we will move on in the agenda. And here's one more. Are many grain user companies that are buying credits in some way asking that the specific grain that gets credit be traced. So tracing segregation of grain in the carbon space.
Okay, at this point, what I've seen would not necessarily have any carbon tracing that way. And in fact, that's a real hard one to do. If you think about the way our grain shipments are handled throughout the US, for the most part, we don't have that traceability except with a few select markets and types. For example, you can think about non-GM grain is oftentimes segregated, but we haven't seen any sort of segregation yet when it comes to this carbon tracing. It's more about not necessarily tracing the carbon itself, but being able to show, you know, say you're let me pick on Bayer just because they're a prime example of this. Bayer is one of these companies that is interested in showing that they're reducing their carbon footprint. So if they can show that they are working with farmers to reduce that carbon footprint, that counts both for, if you will, the farmer and for Bayer as they look at their entire supply chain, because they can claim that credit wherever it happens along the supply chain.
Well, with that, I think we will move along. Chad, thank you. You set the stage really well for Marshall and Christine to dig a little deeper into some other aspects that you started with. So our next speaker is Marshall McDaniel, Assistant Professor in the Department of Agronomy. And we're happy to have him here to shed a little bit more light on understanding carbon sequestration, some of the ability or capacity for carbon sequestration under different conservation practices. So I will turn it over to Marshall to continue our program this morning, or this afternoon. Sorry.
Thanks, Jamie. Can you hear me all right, first of all?
Yes, you sound great.
And now can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, super. All right, well, welcome everyone. Chad, thanks for that great introduction and shout out too. I'm going to be talking about the science on soil carbon, and I am a soil scientist in the agronomy department at Iowa State. And I'll come back to this picture. So this is a picture of soil, obviously. I'm going to come back to it though at the end of my 20 minutes here. If you have any questions that I can't get to during our question portion of this webinar, please email me. This is my email here, marsh@iastate.edu. My research team studies soil-plant interactions. This often includes soil carbon. And you can follow, if you're on Twitter, you can follow the neat stuff that the hardworking folks in my lab are doing in soil carbon and other topics, including nutrients in soils too. So I'm going to talk about a little background with the soil carbon markets, the carbon craze, some terminology and background, address some jargon, and explain just how we measure soil carbon. A lot of you might not be familiar with how it's measured. I'll explain how we measure it. Then I'm going to borrow from our former Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, in a couple of categories here called the known knowns. And Chad alluded to these. And these are conservation practices that increase soil organic carbon and some other known knowns. And known unknowns, that is to say things we know we don't know. So we know that monitoring soil carbon change after a management practice is challenging. I'm going to talk about some of those things that do make it challenging. And then I really want to talk about co-benefits and trade-offs too, because I think it's very easy because we could put a dollar value on carbon now. But there are many other benefits with soils that are increasing their soil carbon that we should be thinking about as well. Those are called co-benefits. And then the unknown unknowns, these are things that we just don't know that we don't know yet. There's a bunch of these things that I'm not going to focus on it because there's not much we can do, and Chad has addressed them already, or Christine will touch on them as well. So government involvement, the one I might talk about a bit more is maybe the best way to monitor or verify SOC as part of that, what Chad called outcome-based monitoring. And then finally, I'll conclude with answering this question: do we know enough about the science of carbon to move ahead on carbon markets? And I'm going to leave you all hanging until the end of my talk to answer that question. Okay, so unless you've been living under a rock, you have to know about the emerging carbon markets, and is why you're here webinar. So I see carbon markets in the headlines, no matter where I look, in local newspapers, even farm journals like Successful Farmer or Farming and Wallace's Farmer, Wall Street Journal. Here's a Iowa farmer that's being featured on the front page, the virtual page of the Wall Street Journal. And then even this recent article I found that I added to this slide, in Rolling Stone, they're talking about soil carbon and paying farmers for this. So as Chad pointed out, no need to, this is just everywhere. And so there's a lot of interest in it. And as a soil scientist, that's great. It means that people are interested in the topic I study and devote a lot of my life to. And even when you look at these ecosystem market information, and this is an older document now, this is the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership document that took 4 of these companies' contracts. And I just pulled out a portion of the table. But as Chad said, this is kind of their outcome estimation. And they include either soil sampling and or modeling. And I work with some modelers, but you know, I like to see soil sampling in there because it means many of these companies are interested in verifying changes in soil carbon. And as Chad had mentioned, and I think Jamie actually posted the link already, one of my colleagues in the economics department, Alejandro Plastina, has a new publication that goes over a lot of these contract details. Okay, so something some of you probably have to think back a long time ago, like me, to think about when I first learned about this idea in, it was probably in middle school, about the transitive properties. So if you remember back, transitive properties is when A equals B and then B equals C. That means A also equals C. So that's what like a quintessential example of transitive properties. So I want to apply this to soil carbon. So every time we're talking about carbon, we're actually talking about some other things, or at least measuring changes in other things. So as I mentioned, we're almost myopically focused on carbon. This is what we want to buy and track with the carbon markets. Although there are some water quality markets and ecosystem service markets, but those are rare. But I want to point this out, that when we're talking about carbon, we're actually also talking about soil organic matter. So carbon is just a fraction of organic matter. Soil organic matter, you might have heard of this term before, is everything in a soil that's decomposed and partially decomposed that makes soils dark. And the Iowa mollisol soils, nice dark brown, black color. And that it's about 58–60% carbon, but there's also hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur in that organic matter. And so when you are talking about or hearing soil organic carbon, or sometimes even I use the terms interchangeably, they're essentially the same thing. It's just that carbon is a fraction of soil organic matter. And then kind of the next step of the transitive property is that soil organic matter is central to all these essential soil ecosystem services we rely on. And this includes water holding capacity, soil stability, so soil staying on a farm field, nutrient storage and release for plant growth, and climate change mitigation, which is why all the interest in the soil carbon markets. And then this is really, those soil ecosystems are really what we're talking about when we talk about soil health. So these things, they might sound different. You might hear these terms in different places, but they're very related, and there's some different nuances there. But I just want to show the connection between soil carbon through to soil health. And I use this term soil ecosystem services, and soil organic matter is really central to many of these soil functions or the benefits that soils provide humans. And I highlighted these, and this is a figure from the Food and Agriculture Organization. It has a pinwheel of all these things that soils benefit humans with. So archaeologists are really interested in this, right? There's human artifacts, cultural heritage buried in soils. Engineers think about soils as a foundation for human infrastructure, but as an agronomist, these are the things that I'm thinking a lot about. So provisioning of food, fiber, and fuels, one of the primary purposes of agronomy, carbon sequestration, water purification, climate regulation, nutrient cycling, habitat for organisms, and flood regulation. So those are the things, even though sometimes we can really hone in and we've got a dollar value on carbon, these are the things that are associated with it, and soil organic matter, which is partially carbon, is really controlling all of these things and regulating them. Okay, so I'm going to start with giving a little bit of context, and I like to use Iowa because that's where I'm living. Maybe not everybody on the call. Hopefully we have got some folks from outside of Iowa. But I'm going to show kind of a brief history of how soil organic matter has changed over the last couple centuries or so. And here on the x-axis, I've broken down this timeline where this line 0 is. This is prior to Euro-American cultivation. And then this is years after cultivation. So this is my own hypothetical slide, but this is actually based on data that I'm happy to provide the publications if anyone is interested. So prior to Euro-American cultivation, soils in the Des Moines lobe are greater than 10,000 years old because the Wisconsinian glacier retreated, soils started to form. And so those soils became what they were at 100% capacity. So then after about 7 to 10,000 years, there were Native American folks living here. We don't have good data on how they impacted soil organic matter. We knew that they were farming and there were more people here than a lot of researchers estimated, but they were doing agriculture and affecting soils. But we don't have a lot of good data, which is why I have this box dotted out. But we know after Euro-American cultivation began, we get this decline in soil organic matter and loss of those soil ecosystem services to where we're at present day, about 200, 250 years for much of the land in the Midwest. And we're at about 50% of the relative soil organic matter. And I'll show some data in the next slide to back this up. But where we're at present day is we want to, I look at this, so this isn't to be a negative Nancy, but this is to just show that we really have a glass that's half full. And I'm an optimist at heart. And so I think there's always the capacity to change and improve. And I like to call this a management intervention. So if we were to take a management intervention on your average farm here, that's 50% of the original organic matter, we would expect that some of this organic matter would regenerate and those soil ecosystem services. We don't know how fast, that's why I put multiple of these lines that are dotted. That's trying to predict in the future. We don't know the speed at what that will happen, but many of these management practices that I'm going to talk to you about, we do know that they do increase soil organic matter. Okay, so before I jump into that, I do want to, before I show you some data to back up that hypothetical graph, I do want to talk about some soil jargon. We often can talk about carbon in stocks, and we talk about carbon in concentrations, and I'll talk about the definition. So a stock is a mass of carbon per unit area, and what's not reported often in these measurements is the depth at which researchers measured. So I have a little example over here. If we've got 15 centimeter depth or 6 inches, and we were to carve out a block of soil, that would be how much carbon is in that block or rectangle of soil. And that unit is, typical units in scientific literature is megagrams per hectare. And that can also be converted easily. 1 megagram is a metric ton of carbon per hectare. And what you need in order to calculate this is carbon concentration, bulk density, and of course, know your depth that you measured it. The advantages is you can compare to plant carbon inputs. So we often represent plant growth and productivity in megagrams per hectare too. So that makes it convenient. It's good to estimate total mass to depth for a field. But some of the disadvantages are that bulk density is onerous to measure. So bulk density is the weight of a soil per volume, and it's also a measure of how compacted a soil is. And this measurement is actually very error prone and difficult to measure. So a lot of companies are trying to avoid this that are doing verification. And there's also a lot of spatial variability with that measurement and carbon concentration measurement. And so typical values in Iowa to about 1.5 meter or 5 feet deep are 100 to 250 megagrams per hectare in Iowa mollisols. Now, carbon concentration is the mass of carbon per mass of dry soil. And I show this because I pull out a little insert of the soil, and most of the soil is inorganic particles, so not organic matter or carbon, but these darker brown dots are the organic carbon or organic matter. And we could represent that in a mass per mass, or grams per kilogram is one of the typical units, or the one that I often use is just percentage. And really the only thing you need to do to calculate that is carbon concentration. Only one measurement is needed. It does not scale to area and nor to plant inputs like the stock does, but carbon concentration is also variable, but at least you're not using bulk density and even more possibly variable measurement. And Iowa mollisols can range from about 1.4 to 8% soil carbon in the top 0 to 15 centimeters or 6 inches. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention. So I have names down here for references, and I wasn't able to give Jamie the PDFs for these ahead of time, but if there's something you'd like to see where I have a reference down, just let me know and I can send it to you later. So when we measure soil carbon, if we're trying to measure it deep, we can use a hydraulic probe like mounted on this Iowa State truck here. Me and my postdoc are collecting some soils. Here, a PhD student is collecting some soil samples for a little bit closer view. This hydraulic probe goes into the soil. We pull up the core, we put it in plastic bags or take it back in an enclosed tubing. Then we often sieve it and we dry it, and then it gets ground in a machine that grinds it to like a flour or powder-like consistency. And then we can analyze it on 2 machines, depending on whether you want organic matter or total carbon. Soil organic matter, we use what's called a muffle furnace. This just burns off all the organic matter at a high temperature. And then you measure by the loss of organic matter, you measure before and after. This is a machine called an elemental analyzer, and as it suggests, it measures carbon, the element carbon. And this drops a small sample of your soil into the machine, combusts it at a high temperature again, but it captures the CO2 and other elements and can give you total carbon, total nitrogen, sulfur, hydrogen, and some other elements that are in organic matter. Okay, so I told you I'd come back to the data on the deficit. So I said we have about a 50% soil organic carbon deficit since cultivation, Euro-American cultivation. So the question is, can we double this? Maybe. So this is a study that my postdoc published last year in Soil Science Society of America. And as part of that paper, he showed, oh, can you all still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, this happens every once in a while. Let me pull that slide back up. I don't know why my computer has problems with the presenter view sometimes. I might just take it off presenter view. I was just getting in the groove.
Doing great on time, so no worries.
So what my postdoc did was he took all these studies that compared an average cropland nearby the same soil type, same climate in all of these states, and the native grassland. And so the native grassland is in the maroon or cardinal colored bar, and then the cropland is in the yellow hashed bar. And then just to ease the interpretation, we have the percent, the percent of the cropland is now compared to the native grassland. And so these are carbon stocks. And as you see, there's a wide range. So there's a couple reasons for this wide range. This study in Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska, they sampled down to 3 meters or 10 feet. So if you sample deeper, you're going to find more carbon. So that's this is part of the reason I'm showing you these data, is to illustrate how important depth and accounting for depth is. And then there are other studies that find less, and it isn't always because they're sampling less deep. Many of these other studies sample to about 4 to 6 inches, but they find less, and that might be because they're in Arkansas or Nebraska, where there's less soil organic matter generally in those states under those soil types and climates. So anyways, that's where we get this 40 to 50% soil organic carbon deficit. So it means we have room for improvement. I just wanted to point out the 4 states or 4 studies here that were in either Iowa or Minnesota, and we can find quite a range even amongst those states. And the reason for ranges might have to do with some of these principles of soil health or management factors. So this is both why those cropland soil carbons might vary, but also the way that we can change them. And so I borrow these principles of soil health from the Nrcs. And they've got 5 principles here: soil armor, minimize disturbance, plant diversity, continual live plant root or perenniality, I'll call it sometimes, and then livestock integration. And then they have multiple practices, or I put multiple practices under those. So cover crops, residue, reduced tillage, CRP, conservation reserve program, or prairie strips. I have a student working on how prairie strips affect soil health and soil carbon. Minimize disturbance, so reduce tillage, lower compaction. This is sometimes called controlled traffic farming. And also CRP or prairie strips. Plant diversity, cover crop mixtures, crop rotation, intercropping, CRP or prairie strips. Intercropping means planting crops at the same time next to each other. Crop rotations would be rotating crops over time, kind of diversity through time as well. And then the perenniality, so using cover crops, growing a perennial crop like switchgrass or miscanthus. Relay cropping, so you have living crops growing during most of the year. And then CRP or prairie strips, which are perennial crops. So you're seeing some of these management practices. Some of these management practices pop up in multiple principles of soil health. Livestock integration, we've got grazing, cover crops, seed pastures in rotation, and add manure. And I just want to show this table quickly as I kind of move into the conclusions here. That's what that alarm was for. But this is a work in progress. It's a table of some soil health, of some of those soil health promoting practices. The NRCS soil health principles covered: soil organic carbon change in megagrams per hectare per year, so the stock per year, plus or minus a standard deviation. And then the percent change from the business as usual, the control. And that's change, a percent change in carbon per year. And these are the 95% confidence intervals. The other information isn't as important. It's just the number of studies included in these meta-analyses, the mean number of years that they're included, how deep they sampled, the mean, and then the range in depth. So many of the samples only sample to about, or studies sample to 22 to 21 centimeters, which is just about a foot. And there's some references here if anyone is interested, but I do want to just point out there's a range from about 1/10 of a megagram or ton, metric ton per hectare per year, up to, in CRP or restored prairies, about 1/2 of ton per hectare per year. We didn't have a rate for the biochar, but it was one of the greater practices that increased carbon. Biochar is a form of carbon that breaks down very slowly. So that's why we see this large effect, and many of these studies added a large amount of biochar. I'm going to talk about one example really quickly. Actually, I'm going to skip that because I'm due on time, but if you're interested, I have a publication that took place. The data was collected over 12 years in Iowa by my colleague that just retired, Dr. Mahdi Al-Casey, and his colleague David Kwamenza, and they sampled 7 sites in Iowa and collected soil carbon down to 60 centimeters or about 2 feet at all these 7 sites and monitored the soil carbon over a 12-year time span. They found no strict tillage and no tillage increased, but the other tillage practices, moldboard, chisel plow, deep rip, did not increase. So I just wanted to fly through that quickly so that I keep consideration of your all's time. But I do want to end with this. So monitoring soil organic carbon change is challenging. There's a lot of natural and spatial variability. We need baseline or original measurements. We need to know soil depth, but how deep we need to sample to monitor change, or have a good idea of modeling or paying out benefits for it. That's still kind of one of the known unknowns. How to handle soil sampling and carbon analysis. We know carbon changes slowly. There's some soils that changes a little bit faster, and statistical traditions can hinder us. I think we need to think beyond some of our traditional statistical processes. And then there are many co-benefits that I mentioned, like water storage, soil stability, nutrient storage, and then there might be some trade-offs with increasing soil organic carbon. For example, some greenhouse gas emissions might go up as soil carbon increases. We know some practices decrease yield, even though soil carbon is going up. And I just want to point this out very quickly, just to show that even though we can't measure change in soil carbon rapidly and very easily, these are 2 soils. One is from an 11-year-old restored prairie, and the other is from a corn soybean. It's been in corn soybean for over a century, and it's the soil on the left. It has more worn down aggregates. The soil on the right is from the 11-year restored prairie, has larger aggregates, more roots, and also visually darker in color. I hope you all could see that on your screen. And I would like to just conclude that, do we know enough about soil management and soil organic change to inform carbon markets? The answer is yes, so with cautious optimism. Where science should focus to improve recommendations, invest in long-term experiments. They're few and far between. And there's a question of whether or not we need to sample deep and then explore trade-offs with other greenhouse gas emissions and yield. We're working on a meta-analysis that will help us balance these trade-offs and develop inexpensive, accessible ways to measure soil organic change, soil organic carbon change. And at this time, I'd like to take any questions. And again, this is my email. This is a prairie strip shown here from Dick Sloan's farm near Raleigh, Iowa. And my research group is at Soil Plant Interactions on Twitter.
Great, thanks, Marshall. We do have a couple of questions. So I want to paraphrase this one because I know this is a kind of an active emerging area. So what are, or what is the role of the anaerobic digester in sequestering carbon, and then, perhaps storing greenhouse gases, and even some more opportunities there in terms of, distributing nutrients back into the environment. So thoughts there on their role.
Yeah, so I'm part of a larger project that's led by Lisa Schulte Moore. I'm part of a team that's going to be looking at that. So anaerobic digestion is when you take animal manure and some living plant feedstocks, and you can combine them, not all the time, but that's the 2 feedstocks we're looking at. So animal manure and plant biomass, and you can create methane from them, and it reduces the emissions. So that we haven't really talked about anything about soils yet. So that hasn't gotten to soil sequestration, but what we might be able to do is then after that anaerobic digestion that process might reduce greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. We can perhaps use the spent material called digestate, apply that to crop fields that will improve crop growth and potentially sequester more soil carbon. So it has these kind of knock-on or positive feedback effects. not only are we getting the benefits at the digester scale, but also maybe when we reapply it to farm fields too.
Another question related to livestock. So would livestock integration compromise wetland and water tables by leaching or having runoff from integration of livestock into those systems?
Yeah, that's one of the things that one of those trade-offs. And like anything, you can have too much of a good thing, right? So manure, I don't know if there's any Seinfeld watchers out there, but I've mentioned this to Dan Anderson too. So there's an episode of Seinfeld where George says, "What's wrong with the word manure? It's ma, like your mother, and newer, something newer." And so, yes, manure is good. We've got data. I've got a meta-analysis that shows about 10% of every unit of carbon you add from manure ends up as soil carbon. So 90% of it is eventually emitted, but it does build up soil carbon. But the concern is if you add too much and it's not worked into the soil, you could potentially have water quality issues that are unrelated, other than it came from applying too much manure, maybe at the wrong time too. So we know don't apply manure on frozen soils in the winter. So timing your manure, getting the application rate right, and just using some common sense about it too can help mitigate that problem that one of your questioners asked.
All right, next one. So what impact does compaction have on carbon?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one, it makes it challenging to measure it. So there have been a few recent papers that have shown that, whether or not your soil is compacted, it could measure your total stock value. And this gets back to that idea that measuring bulk density is just really tricky and tough to do. So there's that impact. But then there are kind of like indirect negative impacts of carbon. And so I had a student who works for the Nrcs in Indiana. She looked at controlled traffic farming and found that when you had controlled traffic farming and you didn't use the machinery throughout the field, it tended to increase aggregation and soil stability. So there are these kind of indirect negative impacts of tillage that eventually will start to, or not tillage, compaction on soil carbon and storage. And I think there's a wide and long history of compaction experiments too that showed negative impacts on crop growth, which has negative impacts on soil carbon because most of the carbon that's coming into a soil is coming from a plant.
We're going to have one more and then we'll move on, but I thought this was interesting. In terms of biochar, is it better to surface apply, incorporate, or inject? Don't know if I've heard of injecting biochar, but
yeah, I'm not a biochar expert. Our biochar expert retired a few years, David Laird. Many of you might know him. I think you can inject it with like an air seeder potentially. I think maybe what that questioner is asking. Tilling it in would probably be good. So I'm kind of making an educated guess here. Because you're kind of spreading the benefits. So there are other benefits rather than just increasing soil carbon. Biochar holds on to nutrients. It has a high cation exchange capacity. So it might hold on to and resupply nutrients better to crops. So rather than keeping it on the surface, you're also allowing it to spread further through the soil profile and affect growth. Also, just leaving it on the surface, one of the concerns that first popped into my head is that biochar can be very hydrophobic, meaning that water can run off it. So you might actually decrease your infiltration if you have biochar sitting on top of it, but rather it incorporated might improve the overall infiltration. But again, that's a trade-off. If you're no-till, it's hard to apply biochar and then to have the incentive to till it in.
well, thank you. We will end questions there, and with any time left at the end, come back to you, Marshall. But thank you very much. I think that that really helped dig in a little deeper on dynamics within the soil and capacity of some of the practices. So next we have Christine Tidgren. Happy to have her joining us from the Center for Ag Law and Taxation, the director there. And she is going to share with us the considerations to think about, questions to ask if you are considering entering into some contracts related to carbon.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks to Marshall and Chad for the great information that you've shared. I get to talk about this section that is a little bit up in the air, because anytime you're talking about contracts for something, it's going to be individual, and it's going to depend upon the language within your agreement. So this is a really emerging, evolving area, and so we don't have a set contract. So when I'm talking to groups, for example, about wind energy contracts, every contract you enter into with a wind developer is going to be different, but there are some pretty standard provisions that every agreement contains. And what I've learned about this market and this new space is that that's not really the case. There are, as you've heard this afternoon, and as you likely know, a number of private companies kind of venturing into this area. And there are very interesting, unique arrangements that they're developing. So every company is doing it just a little bit differently. So it's not just a standard, you know, we're doing this and maybe the contract will look a little bit different. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is just walk through, I think, kind of some of the key things that you need to understand if you're interested in entering into one of these contracts, to make sure what it is that you're selling, to make sure what it is that you're obligating yourself to, and to make sure that you understand what your obligations, rights, and risks are. So, you know, when you consider any of these contracts, I think at this point in this arena, one thing that we do need to consider is any future opportunity costs that would be lost. So we go into one of these contracts, we are essentially signing away our right to engage in one of these transactions with somebody else next year, because, you know, they're varying lengths, but they're typically, you know, 5 to 10 years. And in an emerging space like this, I think you need to think really long and hard if you're ready to sort of go down that path with that sort of long-term contract at this point, not knowing sort of what's around the corner. Do you gain anything by being in on the ground floor? Maybe, you know, you have to consider that. But maybe that's not the best option for you. I think at this point, it's really important for anybody who's interested in these to investigate all of their options and get really informed. Don't just take the first offer that appears at your door. Somebody shows up, knocks on your door. Okay, get an extra $10 an acre. Sounds good. I'll sign it. It's not like that. We really need to be informed about what we're signing. I say things seem different this time around, but some of you were around back in 2008, 2007, 2009. During that time, it looked like there was this emerging carbon market. There were contracts being signed, people engaging in these transactions, and then that sort of died away. We don't know what's happening. There seems to be a lot of momentum here. But again, we just have a little bit of time. So I just want to highlight some of the key things that I think we need to watch for in any contract that we would go ahead and sign. And my key advice is always just consult legal counsel if you're going to sign a legal contract. You don't want surprises in the end, and the little bit of money that you pay up front to have somebody review the contract for you will likely be much less than it would cost to enforce something or defend something later down the road if you didn't happen to understand exactly what it was that you were getting into. Because just like any contract, the contract that's being proposed to you or presented to you is going to have been drafted by the attorneys for the aggregators or whatever company that you're working with. And they're always going to write those provisions in the best interest of the company. That's what they're paid for. That's their job. And so you need to have your own counsel as well, protecting your interests and your rights. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's really no standard agreement. There's no standard arrangement. I think everyone's trying to figure out the best way that this particular, that these transactions might work, the best way to get these credits out there, the most efficient, the best way to verify, et cetera. So everybody's trying different things. They have proprietary systems. It's not really easy to go out and find a contract to see what it looks like or to compare the terms of different companies. It's not just out there in the public space, which makes it a little bit difficult. So the key thing is just to understand what it is that's in the agreement, what questions we should ask. And boy, we have a lot of questions, right? The first one is understand what it is that we're creating or selling when we enter into this contract. So it's going to be a promise that we're giving something up in exchange for something, but this is all sort of ambiguous because what is being created by virtue of my entering into this contract? We talk about this carbon credit, but what is it? Well, it's some kind of an asset, right? But most likely it's a digital asset. It's not a tangible asset. It's an asset that says, yes, you have removed this much carbon from the atmosphere. This is something you own and you have the right to sell that. But within this contract that you enter into with either the aggregator or whoever it is that you're entering into, do you retain ownership of this credit that ultimately gets created? Or do they own it and then they resell it? Or are they helping you create it and then it goes out onto this market space and then you get paid once it's sold because you continue to own it? Lots of questions and differing results depending on who it is that you're working with. And so the key thing is, what are my obligations in order to get the asset actually created? Because the key thing is we're working with these folks so that we can create a carbon credit or a carbon offset, but to actually create it, I have to do something. And so we have to understand what it is that we're obligating ourselves to do. And then are there other legal obligations or contractual arrangements that are being put into this contract? We just have to watch and make sure. Is there like a lease in there? Is there some sort of easement? Is there the right for the company to come onto our property at any time? Are there certain times they can come on to verify or to check or to see what's happening? We need to make sure that we know what's in there, and all the contracts are going to be different. Are there specific practices that I have to implement, and when do I have to implement them? Or is it just a promise that I will engage in practices that will reduce the carbon offset? Different contracts have different language. And then, of course, the big ones that the scientists have talked about, and Marshall just, has addressed, is how do we verify the sequestration? But from my perspective, I want to know who's paying for the verification, right? Because sometimes it's the producer who actually has to pay for it. How often is there a verification process? Is it yearly? Is it every 3 years? What if I fail the verification? Is the contract terminated? Do I get another chance at it? One of the things that is inherent in a lot of these contracts is a lot of reporting obligations. So make sure before you engage in one of these contracts that you are committed to doing the reporting that's necessary in order to get the benefit of the contract that you're entering into. Because there's not only past history that is often required to be reported in quite deep, quite large detail, but also you have to keep track of all the practices that you are implementing along the way. Am I going to have to document everything I do along the way? Can I change practices once and move to a different one? Just these are items that we need to make sure that we have the right to do. And what is it that I'm giving up? Is my commitment to this contract going to impact my ability to do my agricultural production? Are there things that I'm not going to be able to do in exchange for entering into this agreement? And then what are my costs? Because we talked about the verification, but are there other costs? Am I going to owe the aggregator a fee at a certain point? We just have to understand all of the costs along the way and make sure that we don't think we're getting X number of dollars when in the end, we actually have all of these expenses that go along with it. Am I giving up my right to enroll my land in CRP? Could I still sell a conservation easement or donate one while I'm under contract? Or is this something that is going to be exclusive and I'm giving up rights to enter into these other agreements as well? And then just think about what future opportunities we might be missing. Again, am I selling something that can never be reclaimed? You heard about additionality this morning or this afternoon already. The idea that, you know, we only really are creating something good for the environment if we're doing something different that we haven't done before. And so if I'm entering into this agreement here and I'm creating these credits, you know, down the road, have I lost out on my ability to do anything more? Or are there always going to be more additional practices that I could do if a new program or a new opportunity opens up? And then the lengths of these contracts are going to vary. So we really do need to understand what they are. Some are 5 years, some are 10 years, some call for a yearly renewal. So when you have that many variations, you know that there's also extreme variations in terms of what the contracts are actually calling for. Is there an automatic renewal provision, right? Because sometimes we might enter into a contract where I don't have the right to say whether it renews or not, but the party I'm contracting with holds all the cards. So is it the kind of thing that if the aggregator wants to renew it, that they have the ability to do that, but I have no say? These are just questions we need to ask. Also, is there any further retention agreement or obligation that follows me as a tail, sort of after the termination of the contract? So if the contract says it's for 10 years, is there anything additional that I will be obligated to do by virtue of having created and traded this credit? Sometimes there's retention agreements that are part of the deal where I have to agree to retain that carbon that I've already created the credit for. So you just need to understand any ongoing obligations. When the agreement closes, am I really done? Do I then have the right to enter into a new agreement with someone else? Can I move forward and do something different, or will my opportunities be over? Are there any impacts in my entering into this contract in terms of my ability to lease my land to a tenant? Well, if I'm currently farming and I enter into this contract where I'm currently in charge of my farming practices, and then I decide to lease my land, who's going to then be responsible for the agreement? Can it be assigned to a tenant who takes over? These are all questions to consider if you have any thoughts of leasing your land. Would the agreement impact a future land sale? What if I'm under contract and then I decide I want to sell my land? Could the potential buyer of the ground take over the contract? Would it terminate the contract? Would I owe damages? What are the implications if I would happen to sell? And does my agricultural lender care? Do I need to talk to my lender about this? Well, likely yes. So these are just all considerations that we need to think about and questions we need to ask. And I have probably more questions than answers today, but I think it's because we're at the beginning of this period where these arrangements are really kind of coming together. And so the contracts are evolving. And so it makes for a lot of questions and a lot of differences between how companies are handling these. What if I'm a tenant? Because we've seen a lot of these companies approaching farm tenants and saying, hey, don't you want to sign up? you need to participate. You're renting this land. Yeah, you're free to create these credits and get paid for it. But there's a lot to think about if you're a farm tenant. First of all, you definitely should never try to engage in one of these contracts without getting explicit and express permission from your landlord, discussing any sort of payment arrangement that would be made, putting something into the lease to explain how this would all work out between the two of you. And really, if you're working with an aggregator, they're going to require you to have the landlord assign any rights they would have to you anyway. So they're going to probably require that. But just know that just because you're leasing the land, you don't have the automatic right to go and sign one of these agreements. You could get yourself in trouble if you don't involve the landlord in that. Also, don't be entering into a contract for carbon credits that is somehow longer than the term of your lease. So you really only be a candidate for this type of activity, I think, if you had a long-term lease with your landlord already. So again, you work with your landlord. If this is something that you both are interested in doing, by all means, investigate it, decide if you want to move forward. But otherwise, if your landlord doesn't want to participate, then I think that your participation is really off the table. And again, if you do engage in this and the land is leased, you need to restructure your lease to spell out the different obligations and the duties that each party would have. And if you're the landlord and your tenant approaches you, what should you think about? Well, I guess you'd say, what is the benefit that you're receiving from assigning your rights to the tenant? This is tied to particular land. So it's your land that would be in this contract. It's your land that would appear on this database that shows where the carbon credit is created, what carbon credit is for sale. So it's tied to something that you own and control. And even though the tenant is on the property, you still have a say in whether they are able and entitled to create carbon credits. Now, if this is something that you're on board with because you are in favor of the environmental practices and you want to promote that, then definitely, work with your tenant and figure out the best way to do that. But I would also advise you to have the tenant give you the agreement, of course, that they would be signing with the aggregator, and then you take that agreement to your legal counsel and just make sure that there's nothing in there that looks like it would obligate you to something that you're not expecting or that could harm you later on. You don't want to assume a lot of risk. We're not talking about contracts that are paying, thousands and thousands of dollars at this point. The amount of money that we're talking is low enough that we need to make sure that any risk we assume is really worth it in the end. And then I would suggest that if the tenant is engaging in this, that you would seek an indemnification agreement from that tenant so that if anything, out of the ordinary happens, that you would get reimbursed. Now, make sure you understand how much money you'll be getting paid, how much is being promised to you. There might be a dollar figure that's put in this contract, but make sure that there aren't a lot of additional costs and expenses that you are responsible to pay, because that would quickly reduce that payment that you're promised. And then make sure you know when that payment is going to happen. In some cases, you're going to get a payment up front. In some cases, you're not going to get a payment until maybe after a year you've implemented something. There's the verification process. In some cases, you get a percentage of the payment, and then you get the additional payments in future years. So these really do vary. And then another key thing is, how are you going to get paid? Are you going to get paid in cash? Are you going to get cryptocurrency, like a Bitcoin type of thing? Are you going to get tokens or other credits as payment? Make sure that you know what those payments are. Watch really closely in terms of what your remedies would be if the company that you're dealing with would go out of business or declare bankruptcy or just not pay? Are you stuck going to arbitration, going to mediation? Are you signing away your right to go to court? A lot of these agreements, again, they're going to be drafted by these companies, are going to likely take away a lot of normal rights you would have to prosecute your rights, and they might limit you to something like arbitration. If you don't want arbitration, then try to negotiate that, but you just need to be aware of what these are. Also, what would be the penalties, the breach of contract damages, any liquidated damages that you would have to pay in the event that you weren't able to fulfill your obligations under the contract? What's the worst case scenario? What if you have an unexpected event that happens that makes it impossible for you to comply? Is there any way out? Could you terminate the contract? Would you have to pay back everything that you've received, plus damages, plus penalty, plus interest? You need to know exactly what you are facing before you sign. What about privacy protection? Are you giving others the right to access your land at any time? What about your data? So you've got all of this information about the land, you've got information about the practices that are implemented to create the credit. This is likely going on a database somewhere that might be public. Is there personal information that will be there? Just make sure to know who's owning that data, what they're going to do with it, and how they're going to protect your privacy. Another very practical question, but one that is important to understand, is what are the tax consequences of engaging in one of these contracts if you're actually selling a carbon credit or if you're getting a contractual benefit? It does appear most likely that under either one of those scenarios that payments under these agreements, in most cases for a farmer, are going to be ordinary income. So taxed in the year that you receive the payment, subject to self-employment tax. This is really something that you're selling as part of your farming business. Now, if you were purchasing this or creating this as an investment asset, it would be different, but most likely that's the way it would be. And so my takeaway before we turn to questions is just the key thing is seek trusted counsel before you sign any contract. And I think here at this time, with these contracts being fairly new, not something that these haven't been the subject of lots of scrutiny by lots of legal minds. These are kind of evolving, brand new contracts. Many of them are very different. So I would suggest that you definitely seek your own counsel before you sign anything. Consider the risks, and as I mentioned, any lost opportunity costs if the industry evolves to the point where it's something new and different that's available 2 years from now that maybe you would rather participate in. So really do your homework, investigate your options, and think long term. So with that said, Jamie, are there questions for us?
Yes, there are a couple here. So we'll start with how much, if at all, does the law around traditional mineral rights inform the new carbon credit marketplace? But that was really an interesting take.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I would say that from my perspective, it's really different because really more what we're doing here is creating an asset, almost like a new commodity. So if we think about an agricultural producer who raises cattle or raises, grows corn, growing a commodity, you're raising, creating inventory, and you're selling it as part of your business. Here, you're creating really what's a digital asset in most cases, because again, it's not tangible, the actual credit that you're trading, but you are creating an asset. Even though you are removing carbon from the atmosphere, and that's what you're doing, the actual asset you're trading is an intangible asset that really is more in lines with being a new piece of inventory that you have for sale. So for that reason, you're not selling a mineral or something that you have in your ground. You're not selling the carbon itself. You're selling a credit, which is a new intangible asset that's created. So for that reason, I don't think that the law of mineral rights is terribly helpful, but I might be surprised, and maybe we'll have a whole new area of law that emerges where that does inform.
Thank you. So you touched on data ownership a little bit. So this one's related. Is greenhouse gas emission considered private information, or as part of the national carbon inventory cap? Isn't that public information? So how does that connect there?
That's a great question. And I think that, we'd have to look at the different contract language, first of all, to say what's considered in the contract itself, public or private, because some of the contract language that I've looked at just says out front that this will be public, and there isn't any protection. And as far as what you referenced there, what was the inventory? What was that you referenced in the question? There was a name.
Yeah, national carbon inventory cap.
Yeah, I would have to look at that. I don't know what the privacy protections are within that, but that's a really great question.
Sure. Next one relates to the landowner-tenant, relationship and consideration. So is it typical that these contracts would bind future tenants or future landowners? Does it go beyond that term of their lease?
So that's a really great question, but these contracts that we would enter into with the aggregator, they're not themselves going to be connected to the lease. So what's going to happen is if I enter into one of these contracts as a tenant, and then my lease expires, I have now no more right to give anything of value from that land because I no longer have the right to be on that land. So in other words, it would seem at that point that you've breached your agreement with the aggregator because you can only give what you own. And that's why if you're the tenant, they're going to require that you get the landlord to assign their rights, because they would want to say that if somehow the lease ended, now the landlord is required to take over. So that is something that is going to be very technical and you're going to have to look at. But just remember that the lease is the agreement between you and the tenant, between the tenant and the landlord, and this other agreement is totally separate, and they're going to overlap and they're going to intersect, but they're not going to protect each other unless you build protections in there. So good questions.
Thank you. I think all the others are more big picture that we'll hold to the end if we have some time. So I don't believe, oh, here's one more. Oh, sorry, about the PowerPoint presentations. Yes, we'll with permission of all the speakers, post those as well, along with the recording of this entire session today. So I know Christine had a lot of fantastic questions and folks will be interested in having those. So we'll be sure to post those as well. So in the interest of time, though, we will shift over to Chad to wrap us up here today with an overview of some of the current programs and opportunities. Certainly won't be a complete inventory of everything, but can give us a taste for what exists and what those opportunities might look like for farmers and landowners.
Yep. And so as you could tell, as Marshall and Christine talked there, I described it and I've used this before, and I was glad to see someone else did as well. We're in the Wild West of carbon. We're trying to figure out just what the rules are, how we will play with them. And rules are ever changing as we look out there right now. And that's why, as Christine said, we're asking a lot more questions than necessarily we're providing answers, because that's the stage where we're trying to form these markets as opposed to work within them. There are plenty of private sector initiatives here. And as Christine laid out, that leads to all sorts of questions about how each of them is approaching this. And they all do have vastly different approaches here. The idea is not only do you have companies trying to become I'll go back to a word Christine was using a fair amount, aggregator. So there are companies that are interested in sort of being, if you will, a broker. They're looking to be the ones that buy the credits from the farmers and then turn around and sell those credits to other companies, other entities that are looking to offset their carbon emissions. And so when you think about it, you know, what we're creating is, you know, the supply chain, if you will, for carbon as we're moving through time, and creating new companies to fit that middle space in between the farmer and the end user for the carbon credit. Those end users, that means we have plenty of partners with which to work with out there, not only these aggregating companies, but the idea of all the various industries that are interested in marketing themselves as being more sustainable as we move forward. In this case, this is one of the entities that's out there, which is the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium. They are active in trying to create a carbon market and creating some carbon opportunities out there. And this is just a showing of the partners that they've created. And so you can see here that there are a lot of agricultural companies in here, but there's also environmental entities in here and a lot of consumer goods. So you'll notice like Tyson, McDonald's, PepsiCo. So the idea is it's looking across the entire ag and food space here, trying to figure out, again, every company looking at how do they manage their conservation or sustainability efforts and utilize beyond something just within their own company. Now, as Christine sort of mentioned, the idea is right now everybody's sort of either creating their own rules or working for different rules. Here I've highlighted another of the companies in the space, Indigo Ag, and sort of showing how they describe their process. And the idea is each company is different right now. They have their own process, they have their own payment streams. And those payments right now are floating around the numbers you're seeing on the screen. A lot of the discussion is around the pricing point of around $15 to $20 per carbon credit or per ton of carbon dioxide out there. A lot of the actions we might see within agriculture, as the graphic here shows, could create up to 2 credits per acre per year, depending upon how large the practice is and, you know, how many practices you are implementing. And so this is showing some potential benefit here, but again, I want to scale it back, and Christine sort of hit upon this, is that when we're thinking about this again is sort of like, for lack of a better term, the side gig rather than the main employment opportunity for ag. You think about an acre of corn and soybean land here in the state of Iowa, and you're talking about an acre of land that can generate anywhere between $700 to $1,000 an acre worth of revenue. Here with these carbon credits, we're talking about an additional $30 per acre. So this is, you know, it's a small add-on to the revenue, but again, it's some additional revenue that can be created here. Now, not only do they have their own pricing mechanisms, their own, like I say, practices that they're choosing, but their own measurements. And as Marshall indicated, the idea is the measurement side here is also in flux as well. And so that's why I would say the consistent message is here is that if you're wishing to participate in these markets, you have to do your homework, look at that agreement and see what it says. Now, in order to help that along, luckily here at Iowa State University within the Extension Service, we have lots of folks that have research expertise to dig into some of these issues. And so one of my colleagues, Alejandra Plastina, grad student, Ornush, and I won't try to butcher her last name, but you can see it there at the bottom there. They have gone through 11 of the, let's call them, more popular contracts we are seeing right now in terms of carbon opportunities out there, and have sort of asked the questions, a lot of the questions that Christine laid out, to try to look at where do we see some harmonization being created here, and also where do we see the differences among these carbon opportunities. So this is available now on the Ag Decision Maker. It came out last month. And the other thing I might caution you on with this report is that these opportunities, like I say, are continuing to evolve. And in fact, the idea is that some of the details we may have laid out in, you know, in Alejandro and Ornush laid out in this report can change at a moment's notice, do change quite quickly. And so the idea is that even if we have your contract summarized here today, that doesn't mean that that same contracting opportunity will look the same way next month. So again, it goes back to making that connection and making sure you read the contract that you have in front of you. Now, as Alejandro and Ornush went through these 11 contracting opportunities, they divided them into what I'll call 4 major categories. At the top, I've called them carbon market entities. This is Indigo, Noriag. These are the aggregators that Christine was sort of alluding to here. These are entities that want to be that middleman or middle person, if you will, in the transaction, connecting the farmers that are creating the carbon credits to companies that need those credits. And they're specifically targeting carbon only as part of their approach here. Going back here, you go to the second category, you notice I say carbon and ecosystem service market entities. As Marshall mentioned, a lot of this carbon is related to other ecosystem services. And just like you could pay for carbon and carbon credits, it's possible to create credits for other ecosystem services, such as water quality or targeting other greenhouse gases directly. So there are a few entities that are doing that. As I mentioned, one, and ecosystem services market consortium is one that is targeting beyond just carbon, looking at other greenhouse gases. The soil and water outcomes necessarily say they're looking at water quality and the potential to trade credits in water quality along with carbon. Then you have this third category, input supply companies, as we talked about a little bit earlier. Not only do you have this potential for carbon credits for offsets for companies, but you could be looking for what's called insets, where it's reducing the carbon footprint of the value chain as your product moves from your farm through other companies and finally to its end use. And so we've seen companies such as Corteva and Bayer and Nutrien offer opportunities in carbon trading within their own value chain as they connect to the farmer. And then finally, you have what we'll call straightforward data platforms, or to put it another way, companies that are interested in creating let's call it the marketplace, like a CME, like a futures market trading platform that would allow farmers to create credits and then trade them directly to companies themselves, as opposed to working through an aggregator. And so you can see there's 3 opportunities that way. As I mentioned, what Alejandro and Ornush did was they sat down and they sort of walked through the contracts of these 11 companies and looked at what is it that they've specified within these, showing again where the similarities and where the differences are. When we're looking at those carbon aggregators such as Indigo or Nori, again, they're concentrating specifically on carbon. These are, I could argue close to nationwide programs here. Nori's looking at all of US cropland. Indigo has been more specific in picking some of the major producing states. And for the most part, they are looking at field crops. So this is very much directed for the most part at crop production at the current stage when we're looking at some of these aggregators. Probably the key feature here is to look at the covered practices. You'll see new covered practices there towards the bottom. Indigo is very specific. They're looking for cover crop utilization, maybe targeting nitrogen reduction, reduced tillage, or diversified livestock rotation. So going back to some of the points Christine was making, each contract, depending on the company, specifies different practices that can be utilized to create the carbon credit within that contract. There are also specifics as far as how much land do you need to bring in to participate in these. For example, Indigo is saying you can participate with as little as 150 acres in one field, whereas Nori is looking for at least 1,000 acres to bring in here. And again, they're looking at it from the interest of their own company and thinking about how easy is it for them to turn around and trade those carbon credits that are being created to other entities down the line. And as Christine definitely hit upon, the idea of the contracts are definitely different depending upon who you're working with. Indigo has set it up as basically a 5-year sort of term contract where it is renewable twice afterwards. So you can think of it as up to a 15-year contract if you were renewed twice. On the other hand, Nori is looking at a 10-year contract, but they also have that sort of outlook that the practices must be, or the soil carbon that is being captured and sequestered here must be maintained for an additional 10 years beyond the contract. So that goes back to Christine's point about some of these contract provisions do have requirements that go on beyond just the life of the contract. Now, one of the biggest questions we often get asked is about the pricing of this. And again, as Christine sort of pointed to, each company is different in the way they've approached this. Indigo mentions that they're looking to pay cash. So we're looking at that, but the idea is it's paid out over a certain period of time. They're willing to pay half that in year 1, 20% in year 2, and then 10% as we look out for the life of the contract, years 3, 4, and 5. With the argument being that, okay, we're going to also have some verification over time that that carbon is being stored in there. I showed you the brief graphic on Indigo, and it was advertising $15 per carbon credit. So as we look here, that was the setup that they had, and they started actually building their market in 2019. They've guaranteed a $10 minimum being traded for fields in 2021. And the idea is that they're looking to sort of, if you will, try to set a floor for these prices and then hope to see prices increase as the carbon trading truly takes off. Nori, on the other hand, is looking to, they'll pay in cash, but they're also looking to create what they call, they call them their tokens, Nori tokens, but it's basically another way to account for the value that you're creating here. And the idea of these tokens is that these tokens will fluctuate in value. So sort of like, if you will, a cryptocurrency, as Christine mentioned earlier. So that the idea is that the value of your tokens depends upon the value of what carbon credits are trading at the time. The more tokens you have, the higher the price goes, the more you would receive for your credits. So you can definitely see, just by comparing these two entities alone, even though they're both specifically just looking at carbon, they're approaching the markets in vastly different ways. And again, you have to get into the details of the contract to see the variety of differences that we've got out there. Now, as we move to the broader ecosystem services portion of the set here, what you see is that those ecosystem services covered are not just carbon anymore. We're looking at mainly water quality, but also potential for biodiversity. And so you can think of as the carbon markets we're talking about today are seen as being a precursor to a whole set of potential markets as we look down the line for what are known as ecosystems services, or I'll think of it as environmental services as well. And so that there's a potential to look at not only each market separately, so carbon is separately than water quality, but you could also think about, and as Marshall sort of mentioned, these practices do interact with each other, sometimes in positive manner in both directions, sometimes negative, but oftentimes you may see some trade-offs, benefits in one area creating issues in another. And so these entities are looking at what is the space that we can carve out beyond carbon to offer opportunities for farmers to be paid for potential changes that have impacts beyond the farm. And so here again, same sort of setup as far as they'll all have requirements and certain things here. In this case, neither of these two entities have any sort of minimum requirement for what they're offering right now. The idea is that the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund is paying cash, and you'll notice theirs is a very short contract. They're looking at 1 year with annual renewal. So theirs is very flexible in terms of ability to get into this market and participate without necessarily locking yourself up for a long period of time. On the other hand, you look at ESMC, the idea is that's a 10-year contract renewable for another potential 10 years as we look out there. And so again, you see the diversity in the requirement as far as the length of time that you must participate. And as you look down towards the bottom, you can see what details that are provided on terms of the payment structure. In this case with ESMC, the idea is it goes back to the models that they're utilizing. And this is something that Marshall mentioned, the models that, are being utilized to help assess or link the practices on the farm to potential carbon savings. And the one thing I should mention, I'm going to highlight Alejandro's work that he's done, but the idea is there are several comparisons that are out there on the internet today. For example, Marshall mentioned the one by the Illinois Sustainable Ag Coalition. They have done some really nice pieces looking at contracts and been trying to update those every 2 to 3 months. You'll also see, I believe it's AgWeb has done what they call a Sustainable Market Innovation Center. And so they are posting comparisons of contracts as well. So you are starting to see this plethora of information coming out to help create some, let's call it generic comparison of these contracts. But that still doesn't mean that you can't and don't need to take this to trusted advisors to make sure the specific contract you're looking at fits your needs. And so as we're looking here, I'll skip down to the input supplying companies. And this is where we start to talk about offsets versus insets. So these companies are mainly looking at the creation of carbon credits that not only, create some additional value possibly on the farm, but again, these credits would be more likely utilized within the supply chain within agriculture. So as you think about like Agoro or Bayer or Corteva, they're looking at these offsets to help offset either the releases of carbon within their own business supply chain or beyond them with their customers and clients. And so again, a lot of this is very targeted with the input supply companies. For the most part, this is strictly targeting crop areas as opposed to, again, livestock. And so again, you see the concentration on covered practices, looking at no-till, reduced-till, cover crops, nitrogen management. And again, a lot of these are looking at longer term contracts, 10 years for the most part, as you look across the first 3, but you'll notice nutrients, which is on a pilot basis, is a little bit shorter. And so there are, again, a variety of opportunities out there. The big difference when we look at the input suppliers is pretty consistently, they recognize that, most farmers, if they're going to participate, would like to see that payment in cash as we move through time. And as you can see here, the idea is that, again, the payment structure is a bit different. Some of it is very explicit, like with Bayer, for example, at $3 per acre for strip till or no-till, $6 per acre for cover crops, $9 per acre if you're doing both. On the other hand, Corteva goes to the carbon credit as opposed to the practice. So you can begin to see that difference again between, are they going to be a practice-based contract or is this an outcomes-based contract as we look out there? And we see differences even within companies embedded within agriculture. And then finally, as we look at the data platforms, again, these are companies that want to help facilitate the market, but they're not necessarily looking to buy credits from farmers. They want to create that marketplace where farmers can connect with the Googles, the Walmarts, the whoever is out there looking to buy carbon credits and create that platform on which that is traded. And so again, the covered practices vary depending upon who you're looking at. The length of contract here varies depending upon where you're looking. And you'll notice like the true carbon, we're talking about, again, at least a 20-year window as we look out there. And the payments, again, move greatly. And in fact, that's one of the things that I've been watching as we look at the plethora of companies that have gotten into this business. I looked at those futures markets I talked about earlier that have been set up for California and the European Union in terms of carbon trading. And what I've seen over basically the past 6-7 months as we've gone through 2021 here is that we have seen I'll call it a slight increase in the cost of that carbon credit. And I'll go back to, the pricing point that we've seen a few times here. Oftentimes you see that $15 per carbon credit. And a lot of companies chose a level like that because that's where those futures markets for California and the European Union were trading at the beginning of 2021. As we look here in August, those prices have bumped up into the, say, $18 to $20 per ton range. And so that's the other thing that's truly evolving here is figuring out what is the proper pricing point for these carbon opportunities. And again, how much value does that move relative to the practice that you're doing? For example, in this case, looking at Bayer's payments there, for example, what they're basically saying is as we look here, is $3 per acre enough for a producer to consider a shift in tillage practices? Looking at the potential costs and benefits of making that shift on the farm, along with the cost or benefit of participating within this carbon market. And that's sort of the balancing act we're trying, this market is trying to feel out here. What is that pricing point that creates not only a supply of carbon credits out there, but does it create enough supply that balances with the demand for carbon credits there? And so, as I've said sort of before here, the idea is that as we look here, the challenge here is we can't give you answers as to whether to participate or not. What we can actively do is promote that and I put this in bold for a reason, do your homework here. Talk with your family, your attorney, your banker, your landlord, your tenant, your trusted advisors, your agronomic advisors on the farm, so that you understand the benefits and the cost and or restrictions from participating in these markets. When you sign that contract, as Christine so eloquently pointed out here, is that you are giving up certain rights. Make sure you understand what rights you have given up and what are your pathways forward if there are unexpected events that occur here. Now, with that, and in the interest of time, and I know we have some general questions out there, I will stop. I think I'll ask Christine and Marshall to come back online too, just in case the questions, depending upon where they roam.
Yeah, there's a couple left here. All of our speakers come back here. I'll ask one. How do you effectively calculate the carbon offset versus the carbon inventory? Okay, I'll dive first and I'll let Marshall tear me apart then. I think when you're looking here, when I think of carbon inventory, I think of that initial carbon stock. And so as the flow, and that's the deal, I would say a lot of this is trying to approach it from the perspective of the flow. It's not that we want to pay for the carbon that is there today. It's that we want to pay for the additional carbon that might be there tomorrow and the day after and the day after. So when you mention carbon inventory, that to me makes a statement of that's the baseline. That's where we're starting from. And that the vast majority of these carbon opportunities are looking at what do you add to that inventory as opposed to pay for the inventory itself.
Yeah, spot on, Chad. I don't have much to add to that other than, yeah, that's the stocks I was talking about earlier. Just, think about it as like your what's in your bank account at day one. When you're taking an inventory on something, you're looking at how much soil carbon per unit area to that depth that you measure, and then how much will change over time is the offset part, or how much you're getting paid for.
Here's more of a kind of philosophical. Are we paying too much attention to the back end of the carbon market? prior to the greenhouse gas even being reintroduced back into the environment?
Well, I think the beauty of the approach thus far is we're looking at both ways to reduce that emission, but also looking at ways to, like I say, increase the retention. And so, you know, going back to the first slide I mentioned, we want to reduce the arrows going up and reduce the arrows going down. So whether you can capture carbon and put it in the soil, or whether you can just prevent yourself from using more carbon, either way, you have the potential to participate in this market.
Did have one back to biochar, since we have a couple minutes. I think this was kind of answered in talking about some of the biochar properties, but what about utilizing biochar filtration to capture nutrient runoff and reapply to the soil? So this is kind of a bigger question related to biochar versus really carbon markets.
Yeah, I'm not the expert on this. My colleague, Michelle Superior, I know, and others in the Ag Biosystems Engineering Department have at least one project looking at that. And I think some folks across the street at the National Laboratory on the Ag and Environment, Agriculture and the Environment, have done some studies on that as well. And they find they work pretty well. So they wrap these, they're like mesh netting socks. Sometimes they wrap that, or they insert inside these socks wood chips, but you could put biochar in there. And they can do pretty good at absorbing nutrients before they go to tile inlet drains, and that water then moves out to a stream or an ag ditch.
Here's another one from Marshall. Do most practices have consistent carbon sequestration each year, or is there quite a bit of variability there?
No, that's a great question. And that's one of those known unknowns in that category that I use. So there's a concept called carbon saturation. So I showed some slides that show the evidence. We're missing about 50% of the potential. We don't know where the new potential is, especially after doing tile drainage. And it's probably not a linear increase, meaning the same increase year after year. I've seen some studies where it is somewhat linear, and then it starts to kind of plateau, meaning you start to reach a saturation point, or an asymptote is another name for that. So that change per year is probably not linear. And many of the models, I don't think, also have that correct. So I think that's another place that's more job security for me. I think we need to understand that, especially in long-term practices. And a lot of these contracts are longer term. And I made that as one of my points, where we really just need to invest in long-term agriculture experiments and measure soil carbon on them as scientists, and then use the information from that plus modeling and other ways to predict what happens 10, 30 more years out into the future, because that is, when the further we go out, the murkier it gets.
One more here and then wrap up with just a few comments. So do we have an idea of what the carbon ceiling of a particular piece of land is, or a carbon floor? Any suggestions on, let's see, removing the relativity of carbon in attractive land?
Yeah, that's the importance. The floor is really the importance of the taking a baseline measurement, right? Or before you do a management intervention. Every soil is going to be a bit different. We know that climate and soil texture really govern the where that floor could be, and also probably govern where that ceiling can be. But then as you start doing things, agricultural things to the soil, whether or not it's one of those practices, probably reduces or maybe can increase that ceiling. So we think, and again, there's not a lot of studies on this. One of my colleagues, Mike Castellano, is one of the first I know of to look at this. He's got an experiment where he's got tile drainage. We think tile drainage might lower, certain types of tile drainage might lower that ceiling. But I think there's still room to increase soil carbon, but we just don't know what that ceiling should be. There's some models can give you a rough estimate, but I don't know how accurate they are, again, because of the lack of these long-term experiments. Some great.
Thank you. Just typing in my email address just to make some wrap up comments. I posted that the webinar recording and the resources that we have posted here throughout the webinar will be posted to that website on the Ag Decision Maker page. And then if you have any comments, questions, maybe some thoughts on future topics we might cover in a webinar like this in the future or through other resources or other extension programming, I'd be happy to take those suggestions or thoughts, and my email is there, benning@iastate.edu. I believe I will get a list of all of your emails, so I'll also send out a short evaluation and links to the website as well, so you have that in a couple places. So thank you. Really appreciate Chad, Marshall, and Christine, your time today presenting this great information and really setting the stage for folks to start thinking about these issues and getting some detail maybe behind some of the headlines that they've seen. So thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining us today for the webinar.
Thanks, Jamie. It's been fun. See
Yep.
y'all.